Good evening and welcome to today's session. So today we are going to speak about OT security, and we also have a guest speaker, Paul Veeneman. Let me start sharing the slides. I hope my audio is visible. Audio is audible and screen is visible. All right.
Yes.
All the participants, we are available in various community channels in the social media, LinkedIn, YouTube, WhatsApp, Twitter, and Instagram. Do follow us, share with your friends and colleagues, and please help us to spread the awareness about security. And we have some announcements. We thought we'll take this opportunity to share here. We have some community partners who have partnered with OT security professionals. The Hackers Meetup is one. The next one is B-Sides, Ahmedabad. B-Sides again is pan-India as well, and they conduct various workshops, conferences. CSA Bangalore chapter as well. If your friends or colleagues are part of either chapters, also do share about OT security. And in case if you want us to do a session for you, please reach out to us so that we can speak on this later on. All right. So the schedule for today is we'll have a brief introduction about the guest speaker today. Then once the session is done, we'll have some quick chat or clarification questions, whatever you have. And for the Q&A session, please use the Q&A option in the Teams instead of posting all the Q&A on the chat itself. Then we'll have a quick conclusion and closing remarks. And very importantly, before we go into the speaker introduction, just wanted to share some house rules that we have. If you are driving, kindly stop at a safe place for the duration of the webinar. Hope you are aware of your surroundings, and the session timings will be from 6:30 to 7:30 p.m. and 15-20 minutes of Q&A. The questions will be managed by the Teams Q&A feature that is available. Do not enter any questions into the chat message. And importantly, please share your feedback form at the end of the session, because that will help us to continually strive to improve and give you more insightful, knowledgeable sessions. And here we go. So we have Paul with us, who has around 27 years of experience working in various industry sectors and has been actively working with the national critical infrastructure in the USA, addressing challenges, providing guidance, insight, and innovation in operations technology, industrial controls, IoT, IAOT, SCADA, cybersecurity, with his knowledge, expertise, and his education background. Paul also is an adjunct professor and does various trainings and webinars, and is also a speaker, keynote speaker as well. He holds various certifications such as CISSP, CISM, CRISC certifications, and is also on board of several organizations, including Minnesota chapter of Information Systems Security Association and International Society of Automation. A very warm welcome and really glad to have you here, Paul.
Thank you, John. Appreciate it. Great to be here.
All right, so you can share your screen.
Okay, will do. Thank you very much for that very warm intro, John. Appreciate it. I did have I had a title screen and of course a screen that gave my background. You've been able to accomplish that for me, so thank you very much. I think we'll get started. We'll just dive right in, folks. So you can see on this first slide, and there'll kind of be a medical motif as we go through this over the next 30-40 minutes, because we are talking about when the cure is worse than the disease, especially for OT security. So you can see on the thermometer here, and we're looking at de facto methods of protection leading towards unintended consequences. And we might ask, what does that mean? So on the enterprise IT side, we have a lot of mature practices, methodologies, and tactics that we use to apply layered defense to protect endpoints, servers, applications, systems, services, what have you. But a lot of times those those practices have unintended consequences, even though we're trying to do good things in the OT area with, and I'm talking about traditional OT. So IoT, IIoT is a little bit different when it can be purpose-built sensor and collection data that may be cloud connected. So when we talk about OT, we're talking about PLCs, HMIs, RTUs, IEDs. So your local process control or distributed process control, something similar to that. So, and when we're trying to secure these areas or these process environments, we can actually take one step forward and two steps back because we have unintended consequences that can limit, prohibit, or restrict the base functionality of a process control system and how it's intended to operate. Specifically based for, first and foremost, ensuring the security or the safeguarding of safety, our productivity, and the reliability of our systems, as opposed to on the enterprise IT, the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of data and systems to that nature. And when we look at the history of these, major occurrences, and here's a few examples, of 4 examples. And the first of those is in 1990. There was a routine update, supposed to be a routine update, ended up not being such a routine update, but there was an update to the AT&T long distance network, right? So that update, once propagated to all the systems that were handling long lease lines, ended up it created a national outage, right? And took down significant portions, just a faulty software update, took down significant portions of AT&T's network, right? So it was one of those situations where we're applying a firmware update and then we have an unintended consequence. And it could be not testing, not being able to validate in a lab, such as the one behind me here that I have and I use to do certain testing and validation and verification. But that was one of the earliest instances where we saw a practice that had an impact on national communications. The next, in 2010, the Windows Service Pack 3 update from McAfee. So, and what's interesting is as we play that forward, and you can see ahead in 2024, the same occurrence with CrowdStrike. And at the time, George Kurtz was the CTO at McAfee. And then now here in 2024, he was the CEO of CrowdStrike. So, and it was good that they were able to respond appropriately. But as we can see in previous years, so 13 years ago, when McAfee had this problem where they released an update, had an unintended consequence, and because we have IT systems such as engineering workstations, perhaps SCADA systems and servers, but we have Windows-based architecture inside our process control environments that we have to be very cognizant of, especially as we're updating or providing updates. It could be Windows updates, application updates, certainly endpoint protection updates. And we can, again, these unintended consequences of doing the things that we always do in the more mature or on the enterprise IT side. In 2020, we had SolarWinds. SolarWinds was a little different in that it was malformed data that was coming in with the intent of allowing command and control from potentially a threat actor, right? So, and in fact, this is where testing actually becomes very important. So I don't know if anyone on the call is aware, but there was one government agency that was actually able to mitigate the impact of SolarWinds, and that was the Internal Revenue Service for the United States of America, so the IRS. And the reason was, and it was either by luck or by intent, is their firewalls were configured at a very granular level for outbound communication, and they only allowed the SolarWinds servers to communicate outbound on the required protocols for the required application services, and only to the IP addresses that were intended as part of, it could be SolarWinds core or their cloud presence back in 2020. So obviously when the malformed or the malicious payload of those SolarWinds software updates went into those systems, what they saw was an unintended behavior that the firewall started blocking. Communication and connectivity, looking to establish to other IP locations other than the ones that were allowed for the SolarWinds functionality and feature set within the application. And I think that brings up a lot of points that we'll talk about when we talk about segmentation, isolation, and even how we handle networking, and what is it that we're allowing, and are we being very cognizant of the protocols that are necessary, especially the common industrial protocols that may be operating in your OT environments. And then finally, as we touched before, in 2024, here most recently, the CrowdStrike. And the idea here is that we are not putting things into test and testing those patches prior to a release to production. Now, I understand that there's a challenge there because at the time, and they're changing their focus, but at the time, CrowdStrike just had it was a release directly to their agent, and more specifically the kernel mode application that's running and the delivery of those sys files. And I think specifically a sys file, what is the number, was 291, that had the all zeros as malformed data. So I think CrowdStrike is now reversed, or they haven't reversed, but they've begun to introduce early release channels, or at least some semblance of a test type of channels, so that we can receive updates, test them in non-production before releasing to production. And there at the bottom of this slide, you can see that each instance was an intended cure. And again, SolarWinds is a little different, but it was the general updates. It was, but the threat actor was able to put the malicious code within the updates themselves. But the system made it updates as an antidote, then led to operations and process disruption, right? And these aren't control system problems, but they affect control systems, because it's more for enterprise IT, endpoint application servers and services, but we are impacting the OT or the process control environments. So as we take a look at patient analysis and prescriptions, so traditionally our IT counterparts working collaboratively with us, or maybe in some cases not collaborating, will recommend and apply care and tending of systems within the operating within the process control environment. And this can be network segmentation, firewalls and protocol restrictions, penetration testing, which we'll dive into and get a little bit more specific, antivirus, anti-malware, patch updates, and identity management. All of these are very good for enterprise IT, but in the OT space can have adverse effects, right? So there can be limitations as to the amount of success that you will have when prescribing some of these cures and antidotes inside the process control environment. And why might that be? Well, we know that common industrial protocols operate without the concept of authentication or encryption. They're built for speed, efficiency, and productivity. We do know that adverse effect of updates inside a system can maybe impact not only my production process control, but a worst case scenario is, could I have an unintended consequence against my safety instrumented systems? So the ability to, in hazardous environments, such as oil and gas, chemical manufacturing, nuclear, could I have a situation where a simple Windows update to a Windows system that is operating as a core component and part of a safety instrumented system, does it limit the control system's ability to alert the human counterparts with sounding an alarm, lighting alarm or horn strobe, or the ability to have an evacuation take place of a facility where safety becomes a priority or a critical concern? So these are the things that we need to look at when we're talking about what these remediations may be and how these are considered normal in the enterprise IT environment, but would have adverse effects absent of proper training, proper maintenance, understanding the aspects of these deployments, and in understanding continuous improvement. But OT personnel are not always involved in the discussion or even the security prescriptions that are taking place. And I think that needs to change over time. In a lot of the webinars and the seminars or speaking at conferences, I'm always looking to develop or assist in building a common vernacular or communication between OT and IT personnel. This starts with, and I do a lot in terms of, as John had mentioned, adjunct professorship and teaching courses at universities. I teach to not only the IT students, but I also teach to automation students, teaching both sides cybersecurity and what that means specifically to each of them, so that when we have individuals within the workforce or within their professions, let's say on the IT side, and they're going to go talk to our operations process owners, process operators, engineers, or it could be process control technicians or operations technicians in the work environment, is that we're able to speak a common language and have a clear understanding as to what the goals and objectives are, so that every time IT walks into a facility, that OT doesn't immediately bristle and say, what are you going to break today? Because a lot of times that can happen because we're not, from an IT perspective, we're not taking into account that these are not enterprise IT network devices. There are also dependencies that can be overlooked. And that especially where you have PLCs, master PLC, downstream PLCs, distributed control systems that may have other dependencies that perhaps the IT folks have not taken advantage or are made completely aware of. And that's where documentation, or at least the accuracy of network diagrams, device and process diagrams, process flows, and IT needs to become more cognizant and more educated on what's going on in these OT environments, because they simply can't treat them as endpoints or network devices as they would in the enterprise IT side. And the IT centric solutions, as we've kind of described, can have a negative outcome in those OT environments. When we're talking about network segmentation and firewall protocol restrictions, we do want to have least permission and the least amount of privilege, so that we can protect the safety, reliability, and productivity of those environments. But we have to do so with the understanding that the more restrictive we make a network, it could introduce latency. And we're not worried about the confidentiality or the exfiltration of data, so to speak. What we are worried about is latency and loss of productivity or efficiency, especially when we're talking about OT systems are built for speed and processing and not the confidentiality of data and information. So if we start to take a look at these individual areas and where we might have in a little bit more detail some of the problems that we encounter, right? So segmentation. We have VLANs, subnets, routed boundaries. These are on the IT side. We're doing all of this categorization, this segmentation. Early on in the late 90s, early 2000s, one of the biggest pushes was we need to take the printer networks and make them separate of the endpoint networks, because printers were very chatty, putting a lot of static information out on the network, clogging up broadcast domains, etc. So we started getting into VLANs and subnets and routed boundaries, as it's stated here. That's great for enterprise IT, that level of structure, that level of hierarchy. But what we're seeing is we're introducing that kind of complexity inside OT networks. And this actually coming from some of the manufacturers of OT, and a lot of it can be XDR, EDR, MDR, or any type of response software. So, and the reason that they're looking to do, or the security, could be, let's say, Fortinet firewalls, Palo Alto firewalls, Cisco firewalls, and not that they're producing ineffective products, but they need to create boundaries, routed boundaries, and tiers in order to pass interesting traffic across interfaces. So we're being forced to put in complexity of networks, VLANs, and segmentations in order to arrive at a state that is good for the firewall manufacturer, but maybe not good for our OT networks. And so more complexity actually introduces more or less security because we'll have human error in configuration, patch deployment, firmware updates, and we could be restrictive when OT networks flattened out are built for open architecture speed and access of the control systems or distributed control systems in the environment. You can have the security of hierarchy and VLANs and whatever on the enterprise IT side, but then downstream of our ICS DMZ, where we may have a firewall that isolates and segments the enterprise IT from the OT process, that's where we want to get to a point where we start to flatten out the networks. Now, you can have different VLANs for different groupings or categorizations of devices, right? So we could follow the Purdue Enterprise Reference Architecture. And even though it's more something built on the importance of time and latency within a process environment, what we can do is use the levels to identify the process control network. Perhaps that's a separate VLAN and has our PLCs, the supervisory network, and that's where our SCADA, a local historian, and some of our other more control systems-based applications would sit. But what we need to do is be very understanding or, again, cognizant of the amount of complexity that we're introducing downstream of an external boundary to the enterprise IT. I believe that you want simplification within the OT networks, not introducing complexity, which will undermine some of your security and your capability to safeguard those environments. Firewalls, we kind of touched on this as well. Latency or restriction of time critical data can have a negative impact on processes. Penetration testing, right? So turning loose a penetration testing system inside an OT network can have significantly catastrophic impact because a PLC is not intended to act completely like an endpoint or a server inside enterprise IT. And depending on the manufacturer, it may not even have a full stack complement to its network interface or how it interacts with the network itself. It's purpose built for a subset of capabilities and to be repeated in a process over and over and over again. It could be numerous times even per minute. And so when a penetration testing system hits it and then starts pounding away at different protocols to see where there may be vulnerabilities, that can have an adverse effect. Network management and asset management. I think what we want to take a look at is it's kind of similar to penetration testing. Asset management is critical. So asset management in our OT environment is a critical component. I always see it as a starting point, not the where cybersecurity or investment in cybersecurity services or solutions. That seems to be the starting point that's generally accepted. You have to know what you have first, understand the risks to those systems, and then prescribe the security solutions or the cybersecurity architecture. That's the output. That's how we mitigate the risk that we identify once we know what the assets are. But most legacy and some control systems are not built to handle active inquiries. So I think it's important to have solutions. In fact, I have a shirt on. So Landsweeper. I was able to work with Landsweeper over a period of 2 years to develop the OT scanner to be purpose-built for common industrial protocols. Another one who is a huge in the control system space, Ralph Langner, OT based. Ralph is very ardent in terms of the importance of asset management as a foundation and a core to how are we going to do what we do inside a process control environment. And as we continue through, so encryption authentication, we already know that most common industrial protocols, as well as the devices, what they'll have for authentication is maybe a single password. Encryption starts to bring into latency within the environment. Our data in the OT environment is less about confidentiality and then more about productivity. And a lot of times the data, it's stale in its history the second after it's created, especially what's going on in the in the whatever's stored in the local historian. That information is very important to the enterprise in terms of how to do business analytics and make things more productive and more profitable. But that information can exit the process control environment via data diode, unidirectional communication, but we're not worried about encryption at rest or encryption in transit. Inside the process environment, what we want is speed, less latency. Okay. And then passwords. Passwords in shared accounts. So in any enterprise IT control framework, it could be a NIST CSF, it could have NIST 882, ISO 27001. You always want to be very understanding of the processes and the operators and the process owners within the OT environment. You could have several teams. You could have different engineering groups, different shifts where accounts and passwords to PLCs, engineering workstations, or SCADA solutions and systems need to be known by several groups, right? And that breaks a traditional IT compliance requirement for unique accounts, unique passwords throughout an environment. But it's because of the difference in how we operate in the OT environment, we need to have these shared passwords. And what IT needs to do is work with the OT counterparts and develop compensating controls that secure a system and a process where the passwords and accounts may be shared and may be known by multiple parties. But that's because we need speed in the control room. We need speed to response in the event that something is taking place and there's an incident at hand. We cannot be worried. Seconds can matter. And so we don't want to have to be fumbling around looking for unique accounts and passwords. I am not minimizing the impact of not securing passwords, authentication, and authorization to an OT environment. What I'm saying is that the practices that we have in the enterprise IT are very different than what we would have in the OT environment, especially in areas, as I've mentioned before, nuclear, oil and gas, energy, and chemical manufacturing. These are areas that can be very hazardous. And once an incident starts, it needs to be mitigated or resolved in seconds, not minutes or hours. And then maintenance schedules, patch management, vulnerability. That is always going to be very different from a enterprise IT to an OT perspective, right? Because we have different cycles that are taking place. Even when we're talking about Windows machines that are running OT software inside the OT environment, there can be dependencies downstream of firmware and software that's also running on the hardware components, the PLCs, that has restrictions on what updates that we can apply to a Windows machine. And we have to be very understanding of those levels of dependencies that may exist from the process level. If we're talking about the Purdue model again, process level PLCs and firmware and dependencies up at the supervisory control level in a historian, a SCADA system, or what have you. Updates can lead to a loss of view, or at worst, a loss of control. And these are things that we certainly want to avoid. So as we start to take a look at what success might look like, OT practices and expected positive outcomes. So what can we do if we go back through these various segments or areas that we've talked about and say, okay, segmentation. Keep the OT networks flat. Isolated from the enterprise IT, because that is the strongest threat vector that you will have. Some anecdotal information from 2023 is the most chosen threat vector for threat actors to infiltrate a network and establish a beachhead is phishing. It is chosen 98% of the time. 36% of the time it's effective. And it's 295 days in those enterprise IT spaces on average that you will have that you'll go undetected. A threat actor may go undetected. Having the opportunity to be able to work through the network and find, and it could be the OT operations and being able to infiltrate and create malicious activity, or at worst, a catastrophic event, right? So what we want to do is make sure that we are not exposing our OT environments to external, intermediate, or unknown networks that may lead to an inadvertent connection or routable connection to the internet. That's where a lot of the threat vectors are coming in from. Unless you have exposed PLCs, like in the case of Unitronics and Aliquippa, where we simply had, for convenience, which also undermines security, where we had open connections over the internet to those water and wastewater PLCs. Vital assets, as it says here, vital assets in the OT environment should have significantly reduced or prohibitive access to any external networks. Firewalls, restricting access, but doing so in a manner that doesn't impact the productivity, availability, and the efficiency of our OT systems. Also, security scans, when we're talking about penetration testing, a lot of this can be done passively. So we can have passive discovery or passive collection of information, perhaps doing monitoring against a span port or a mirror port to be able to collect that information. I know that in his book, Industrial Cybersecurity, Pascal Ackerman actually goes much into a lot of depth in this area, and how to set up, if you had a lab, how to set up Wireshark or something similar on a network span or a mirror port to be able to see and catalog what is operating inside my network. What are the protocols that are being used? Can I restrict those protocols only to the common industrial protocols that are actually necessary for operation inside my OT environment? And then for asset management, inappropriate scanning that can tip over. So we want purpose-built asset management scans. These can also be passive in nature, but if they are active, it's a good idea to query your solution manufacturer to ensure that they have purpose-built scanning for the common industrial protocols, to understand that when something announces itself or responds on a Modbus TCP or Ethernet IP and TCP port 502 and 44818 respectively, is that the response of the asset management system is going to query that PLC in a manner that's appropriate. And it would be, for lack of a better phrase, they're going to query that PLC in a slower tempo, and then being able to talk to it and gather information. And as I said before, there's a couple examples of that out in the marketplace. But you do want to be very, you want to communicate to those software vendors and be able to understand the architecture of their software, their scanning engine, and how it operates, so that when we turn that loose in an OT environment, we're certainly not having an adverse effect. And then encryption, authentication. So looking to get this again, preventing the external access to the internet. We talked about this in segmentation. We talked about it in firewalls, and now we're talking about it again. We want to isolate and ensure the safeguarding of these OT environments so they can operate the way that they want. Am I prescribing air gapping? Not unless that's the risk mitigation that is necessary for very specific environments. I understand that there's a network connection capability. I also understand that IT-OT convergence is a trigger phrase for a lot of people. It's very polarizing. We've got folks on either side of that subject. We could have a call just on that alone. What I'm saying is that for every process control environment, there's going to be factors of controls or risk mitigation that you're going to implement that's very specific to your environment. And it may be that air gapping is exactly the solution that you need to practice. Or if there's a reason to have a business and organizational need to have that network connected, those OT networks connected, then what we have to do is be very restrictive in terms of what communication and protocol is traversing those networks. But at the end of the day, we want to work with our IT counterparts in the network infrastructure and the firewall and the routing group and ensure that our OT networks are not reachable from the edge or the boundary or the networks beyond the organization. Because through misconfiguration, infiltration, we can have threat actors that find themselves working their way laterally after establishing a beachhead towards our critical OT environments, and that's something we want to avoid at all costs. And again, as we were talking about password complexity, I think understanding more about the IT needs to have more knowledge of OT devices and operations and understand in the role of passwords and authentication in OT environments. And a lot of times in the webinars or the sessions that I give, where it's not specifically an OT group, I'll do a show of hands in the audience. And a lot of times it's 80% to 20%, 80% IT folks and 20% OT folks inside the environment. Or inside the presentation. And that's where I'll have conversations that are more geared for IT folks to understand the challenges that OT operators and security personnel or professionals such as yourself will have to encounter or be able to overcome. And then finally, I see we've got a question. I'll pause for a question here. Schedule maintenance cycles, right? I think we're all very aware that schedule maintenance cycles are different on the OT side versus the enterprise IT, but these have to become more commonplace. We have to know that we're not going to apply updates to Windows systems, Linux systems, or even our PLCs unless one, we review the information, we understand what the updates are to those to the firmware, the software, and then it's relevant to our environment. A lot of times reading release notes, it could be something that comes along as an update, but we're not entirely sure that that update is meaningful. And so we will pass on that update and maybe wait for a next release as opposed to impacting production just for the sake of doing the update, because that's what we've done for decades on the IT side. Again, a very different thought process on the OT side. John, I'll pause there because it looks like we've got a couple questions. I'll bring up the last slide, which is what does success look like? And I think we've covered a lot of this. I think the most important thing down there at the bottom is most of all, keep it simple. Simplicity inside your OT environments really augments security. I don't know. Go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Paul. So shall we go into the Q&A?
I did see a couple of hands.
Yeah, so there is already some questions. Once that is done, probably we can go to we can ask people to. All right. So Ayan is asking, could you elaborate on how the OT environment affected by the CrowdStrike?
Yeah.
Blue screen of that outage.
Right. So in some of the work that I do, even in critical infrastructure, so I'm working with TSA on airport security, right? And of course, airports were affected. What we saw is really those, and I mentioned it at the top of the presentation, is that we have IT systems that are operating in OT environments, right? So we may have, for Allen Bradley, we'll have FactoryTalk SCADA systems that are applications running on Windows environments. They're usually dependent on databases that could be Microsoft SQL running on Microsoft SQL Server. Inductive automation, right? So inductive automation's Ignition platform can run on Linux or Windows. Engineering workstations are in a lot of cases, Windows systems that have engineering applications. So when we're pushing updates into the environment, especially CrowdStrike, and it receives that sys file number 291 and then blue screens, my SCADA system potentially is down. My engineering workstation is potentially down. If I have Windows-based HMIs or just the screens that have a Windows OS that was actually geared for endpoint protection and part of the release the release candidate or the release structure and receive those updates, then you would have an issue with those, and then they would blue screen. You would have to go back, remediate the update, back it out, and then get it back up in. Or I think they said, John, I think you could. I think if you rebooted like 15 times, then something fixed itself or something to that effect. So, but it would be. It's not the PLCs, HMI, or RTUs and IEDs like a Schneider or Allen Bradley or Fujitsu or a similar hardware platform on the control side, but it would be IT systems, Windows-based IT systems, more specifically, that were engineer workstations or SCADA inside the process control environment, or at the at the very least at the supervisory control level, if we're talking about the Purdue Enterprise Reference Architecture. And hopefully that answers the question. That would give us potentially, loss of view, loss of control. That's kind of what we'd be looking at. So you'd be forced to kind of preside over the manual process at the facility or within the shop environment or the workflow environment.
Right. So there is another question. Considering the vast field of that OT covers and number of process controls involved, what would be the basics an IT engineer need to understand to be on the same page and speak the same language as their OT counterparts?
Okay, there's a lot of directions you go here. It's an excellent question. I was asked this question. I was down at the Houston Security Conference, and we actually, myself and Joe Weiss, were giving this presentation to a very large group. It's probably about 85, 90 people, and we had a couple of questions just like that. Like, what does education look like? And I gave a series of examples. So one, myself personally, it was books, such as like the book that I mentioned, Industrial Cybersecurity by Pascal Ackerman. There's some, I think it's Industrial Controls Unleashed, or the Industrial Controls Hacking book that's out there. So I did some reading ahead of time. I also went out to, speaking of inductive automation and the Ignition platform, inductive automation, I believe they still have this. They have the Inductive Automation University. And if you just create an account and free out of the box, they have all of these micro learning modules that you can go through. And the first few units or chapters are really the basis for understanding what a process control system is. And then what they do is, as you get into kind of the middle and then the back end, they start to get very specific in terms of leading to the core test that you can take for the inductive ignition or inductive automation ignition platform itself. But I found that to be excessively useful. And for myself, because I was at the time with I was in an engineering organization that was supporting three of the largest Class 1 railroads in the United States. And I was in charge of not only IT and logistics, finance, accounting, and some of the other areas, but also engineering and the support of engineering. And I had to take it upon myself, much like the question was, I had to learn how to communicate with the process control engineers so that we were speaking the same language. And I found the Inductive Automations University extraordinarily helpful to get me out of the gate. And then finally, for those of you that know or just follow him on LinkedIn, Mike Holcomb has put together like I think, what is it, John? Is like 8 units of industrial control security. And if you can get through all 20 hours, that should give you a very strong basis or a foundation of understanding in terms of what the process control environments are like, the folks that are in those environments, and the operators that you'll be wanting to communicate and collaborate with and get on the same page. But Mike's training is really quite extraordinary, and he does a very good job of explaining it. He doesn't speak as fast as I do. He's very slow in his process, and very clear and concise. And he's also extremely open on LinkedIn. So if you ever have questions, be sure to connect with him on LinkedIn, follow him, and if you've ever got any questions, shoot him a note. He's very responsive and very active on LinkedIn as well.
Sure. So we have a few more questions. The next one. All right. So if there is an organization that does not have a proper asset inventory, and has limited visibility. Are there any recommended solutions that could help in asset discovery without any impact?
Right. So as I mentioned at the top, there's yeah, so Landsweeper, I work with them. I know that again, OT Base, Ralph Langner's product. These are two product platforms that are very specific and built even at a protocol and an engine level specifically for OT asset management discovery. I believe that in this space, they're probably also very competitively aligned for pricing, right, or cost. I think for what you get, it's very competitively priced. There are several others. I think Tenable, and in fact, they've got, they're Tenable. So Tenable has their traditional enterprise IT scanner. I think they have an OT component to that. I think what you'd want to do is be very cognizant of what that is, and ensure it's doing exactly what you want in that environment. But as examples, right off the top of my head, I think you take a look at Landsweeper's OT scanner, and then they're going to merge the OT and the IT scanner into a single product platform within the next, I think, few months. Certainly, I think this year or into Q1. And then OT Base, Ralph Langner's company, that's another good one. But there are a handful that are out there. I think it's important that everyone asks the pertinent questions and be comfortable with asking what can be uncomfortable questions of your software solution provider and get very specific on how do you query an OT device? Are you just scanning, every, the 65,535 protocols and just banging away at a PLC, because that's not effective. That's just going to tip it over. But that's probably how I would answer that question.
All right. So the next question is just out of curiosity, are there environments where OT components like engineer workstation, historian, HMI, PLC, RTU are integrated with PAM solution to address passwords and account password rotation?
We're starting to see this in new platforms that are coming out. I think what's causing this, John, is probably that secure by design, or at least secure by default. So OT device manufacturers have always pushed back and put security on the consumer, right? So if you buy a PLC, we have a password, or you flip a bit and it locks, run mode versus, update mode. And then security is on you. And that was probably the case, 8, 9, 10 years ago. I think that's changed because now manufacturers, especially with the ISA or IEC 62443 and that series 4, right, where can you be certified in modules, 4.1, 4.2, where you're practicing security by design. ISA is pushing a lot of this internationally. I think there are folks within the OT security space. I know that Sarah Flukes gave a couple of presentations at S4 on secure by design. I think it's important, and I do believe that we're going to start to see this more often. Here's the issue, is that the system lifecycle time for OT environments is 10 to 15, sometimes 20 years. So while we may see devices, and I'm not aware, to answer the question directly, I'm not aware currently of PL's architectures currently in operation with the organizations and the environments that I work with that have integrated components to a PAM solution. I believe that that's coming in a roadmap for a lot of the manufacturers. The problem is even if they were to have that in the marketplace tomorrow, are our OT environments capable of introducing those new components when we have, the life cycle times can stretch on for numbers of years, right? So I think it's going to take time, but I do believe that is probably the next era or the next evolution for PLC components to introduce some of that. But again, it has to be done with the understanding that time is more important than security. safety is also more important than the security.
Right. Yeah, I can agree on that. So Kunal Shah is asking, in your experience, which is the most common mistake among these, and why do you think that's the case?
I think when I've asked in conferences, when I get to asset managers and penetration scanners, I'll usually ask, who here has turned an asset detection or a penetration testing system loose on an OT network, and what's been the outcome? And universally, there's probably 4 or 5 hands that go up, and they said, "Yeah, the outcome was not good." So I completely broke a PLC. It abnormally ended. We had to go reset it. We had to reboot it. The other, I think, starting with asset management detection, traditional asset management detection, and traditional penetration testing, where IT folks, not even bringing the OT operators to the table, they literally set up collectors out in the OT network space and just turn them on. And then your process engineers are wondering what just happened to all of our systems? What is going on, right? I think next, in terms of the how often something happens, firewall changes that are where we're not aware of the common industrial protocols or the ports that we need. More specifically, Modbus TCP, Ethernet IP is a few. Profinet, HART, and DMP3, OPC UA. These somehow get turned off because they're unknown as protocols that need to be allowed across some of those boundary protections that we're setting up in firewalls. And then lastly, mistakes that are made are we're introducing VLANs and network segmentation complexity, tagging and trunking, and there's human error in terms of the tags on ports that suddenly cut off a network, let's say a process control network from the supervisory network, and then I've got loss of view and potentially loss of control. So it's understanding what we have to do if we're going to VLAN, isolate, and segment. Understand those VLANs and those VLAN tags that you're putting in the configuration of the layer 2 or layer 3 switching.
Right. Okay. So the next question, Nate Wheeler is asking, I see a lot of emphasis on the cyber or network security. What about physical security? Example, hardening of devices by disabling local interfaces, tamper monitoring on panels or doors, surveillance, etc.
So I always start off, and in fact, it was Thursday night. So for me, Thursday night, just 2 days ago, I was teaching class at the university, and we had gotten to physical access control. Some of the students, because it's a night class, some of the students actually have day jobs. And I asked them, show of hands, how many lock their control panels every time after accessing the control panel and return the key back to the plant office? And everyone starts to chuckle because we know that for convenience, right? And so physical security, we know convenience is typically undone when I don't want to have to go to the plant office and get the key, and somebody just had the key, and now that person's got the key in their jeans pocket, but then they change their pants and those pants are at home. Where's the key? So we leave the control panel open. The physical access controls, such as proximity cards, key card access. If I have someone who doesn't have a badge walking the shop floor unescorted and follows someone in, and it may be somebody who's with the organization, but if I don't know, and if it's a visitor, it could be a third party engineering firm, someone new with an organization that's on site. At the very least, that individual should not be able to physically penetrate or walk through a series of doors by coming in behind somebody else through that door, not having appropriate marking or badging, not having visitor escort. I think physical access security is a big deal. We see this in manufacturing operations as well, where it can be heat outside can be so excessive, and there's the heat inside, that roll top doors or garage doors are left wide open for airflow. Well, that undermines security, right? I understand that for the environmental controls inside, and trying to reduce heat in manufacturing environments, that can be tough, right? So then we have to have air conditioning inside to control the temperature so that we can have the secure doors down instead of up. But physical access security, and in getting very basic, how do I get through the layers of access within a facility? And here in the United States, we saw this, and it has become a challenge where in Morris County, Washington, there were the threat actors in a truck that drove through the front gate and shot up transformers with a shotgun, right, and took out 33,000 subscribers for energy. And how do we get around that? It's probably resiliency. Yes, Triton malware attacks Saudi petrochemical, but yeah. So physical access control, access to the control panels, certainly the plant operator or the plant office. These have to be taken into account first and foremost. Because that's the most basic means of access. If you can get to the control panel, you can just start ripping out wires or introduce malware into the system.
Right. So there's one more question. There is a question from Setul. What are your thoughts on implementing Active Directory or domain controller in OT network?
Okay. There are times where we will have a large enough, let's say, Windows environment inside an OT network or area. And in those situations where we want, and usually it's trying to meet some sort of compliance or regulatory requirement where I have to have a central authority for account and password authentication. The only I'm usually not one to paint myself into a corner, but I'll get really specific here. Is that the only situation or scenario where I can see introducing Active Directory into is where you have a contractual or regulatory obligation to have a central audit and a central account authority inside an environment where you have to be able to manage, and again, like PAM or identity access management, you have to manage that centrally. You could take care of this with local accounts on systems and manage that. It may be better to do it from a central authority such as Active Directory. Here's the challenge, John, is that Active Directory has to sit on an island, and it cannot be federated or tied into or part of a forest or a tree of another Active Directory. We need that to be separate and isolated from anything else. You have to treat it like it was just this little act. Like if I set up the Active Directory here in my lab, it's just here and it's not connected to anything else. So you have to manage it independently, manage it separately, and then be able to meet your obligations. But I would caution against Active Directory in those environments, but when it's necessary, it can be done successfully and appropriately, but it cannot connect to the rest of the forest, because if the enterprise IT forest is compromised, the OT authentication is compromised, and we simply can't have that.
Right. That is a valid point. All right. So Ashit is asking, in process industry, process safety in particular, drives everything. Hence, entire OT cybersecurity related controls are driven by process safety and safety. So what are your views, especially in designing the OT IT architecture, including segmentation?
Yeah, so I think we had talked about it at the close to the top of the presentation. Is safety first, right? Safety, productivity, reliability, and separate from confidentiality, integrity, and availability on the IT side. And where complexity of segmentation, which is necessary to have a hierarchy of data networks for on the enterprise IT. On the IT side, we've got servers, workstations, laptops, wireless, wired, multifunction printers, scanners, get all these different components that are on the IT side, applications, application services, database servers, what have you. We have a smaller subset on the OT side, and I believe that excessive VLANing, excessive networking, excessive segmentation, complexity inside the OT networks actually has a point of diminishing returns and an adverse effect. And we can see in the history is the success of OT networks is based on being flatter than the OT networks. You can achieve the security and safeguarding safety. You can achieve that through appropriate means in terms of how we're designing. But I think flatter networks, I understand having a process control network, a supervisory network, and then maybe getting into in the Purdue Enterprise Reference Architecture, the idea of a level 3.5, the industrial control systems, DMZ, and being able to isolate and segment and have a separate barrier between us and then level 4 enterprise IT. I think this can be done appropriately. I think can be done securely. And first and foremost, reduction of complexity will ensure the improvement of safeguarding and the improvement of security within those OT environments. But I think less is more in those environments and when we're dealing with segmentation. And to be honest, John, anytime I see excessive hierarchy of networks, it usually has to do with the incorporation of a managed detect and respond that needs those boundaries crossed in order to understand interesting or anomalous traffic or differences in behavior. So again, a lot of the software that's in the marketplace now requires complexity in order to get the information, as opposed to just sitting in a flat network, right? And monitoring, whatever's traversing the broadcast domain, which you can gather off a mirror port anyway and do it passively. So.
All right. So we have a couple of more questions. So Pranjal is asking, what is the future of AI and machine learning in OT security?
So you could probably shorten that up and say, what is the future of AI and machine learning in cybersecurity in general, right? Because that's such a broad topic. We could have a discussion on that alone. I believe, and in fact, I've put together an AI panel. This will be the 9th time, and I've got a panel of experts here in the States that are going to be at a business continuity planners association meeting of all things. I think regardless of vertical, that AI and machine learning are going to give us the opportunity to be able to identify behavior and anomalies that are a threat to the environment. So if you think about capturing log data, right? So if I have a SIM inside my OT environment and I'm also monitoring maybe off of a mirror port the broadcast domain, all the protocols they're communicating. John, the mountain of information that we're collecting, it's almost untenable that a human would be able to churn through all of that data. But AI and machine learning will be able to grow into that space where it can sift through vast volumes of log data, monitoring information, and passive discovery inside mirror ports, all the data that we're collecting, and be able to quickly discern for the human counterpart, here is something that needs to be investigated. So AI becomes the tool. It's not the end result, but it's a tool like all the other tools that we've used over the years, but it has the potential to be probably one of the most difference-making tools when we can sift through vast amounts of data in very short periods of time and have humans be able to be given information by the AI and the ML services and solutions to take action against something or to investigate something. Think of the proactive nature. So instead of being reactive, more often than not, we could be very proactive in being able to stave off or mitigate a potential infiltration, an existing infiltration, insider threat. So an employee walks something in, plugged a USB in, released the Trojan into the network, but we'd be able to see, hey, there's something very odd going on here, and AI has the ability to do that much faster than ourselves and the human counterparts in those operations. I think that is that first step. I don't think it's going to be anything that you want it to actively. We probably don't want the AI and the ML to become the machine operator, as an example, right? I mean, so that's automation and AI governing over the automation. I think you need AI becomes a tool that can be used by the human counterparts in those environments to be able to make effective decisions. But it's the workloads that humans simply can't do at the speed that AI can.
True. That's very true. All right. So the next question by Setul is: are there any advantages or disadvantages of shifting the IDMZ on cloud?
So this is so any control systems operating in the cloud. This is a lot like the IT OT convergence phrase. You're going to get two sides of the camp here. Who say nothing from a process control environment should exist in the cloud, but we do know that we're moving in that direction. Maybe cloud components or cloud architecture works in some verticals, some industries, in some process control environments, and it doesn't work in others. I think where I and it'll be interesting to see how this progresses. I personally would probably say the more hazardous the environment or the more sensitive that safety is to the environment, we probably want localized or on-prem controls and control systems. There could be a variety of situations where, for municipalities, and think about this, John. So water municipalities where cost constraints are of a significant concern, there is the threat of safety in underdosing, overdosing of the water supply to a community. I understand that very much. But if you could have, and we start to kind of get into like the IoT or the IIoT when we're having, systems, sensor systems and data, and we're interacting with it in the cloud. But I think there's going to be this natural progression where, and didn't Emerson, I think Emerson might have already kind of played around with this, Siemens as well. I think Siemens they're working on a cloud component for control systems architecture. But I think everyone's going to have to take a look at safety first and then productivity and what happens. What is the local survivability if the internet is down and I don't have internet redundancy, or an internet outage is vast enough where it not only takes out my primary but my secondary? How do I survive without that cloud component? Like Ignition, and I know we talked about inductive automation, but they have Ignition and then they have Ignition Edge, right? And the two can talk, but I can have remote survivability. So I think even if you had something in the cloud, you still want an on-prem solution that is maybe an edge device that communicates to the cloud so that when the cloud is unavailable, the edge device is performing the basics at the facility or the location. But to answer the question directly, every solution, every environment is going to be very specific, and you always have to look at safety first, then productivity and reliability. And when we talk about reliability, how reliable is your internet connection to a cloud system going to be, and how necessary is control and view in that environment?
Right. So there's one more question before we can take further questions. Faisal is asking how to perform patch management and especially updating in OT without impacting the system. In IT, it is much easier and straightforward, but in OT, it's not the same.
Right. Well, you have to have downtime. And downtime in an OT environment can require that production has to cease. And typically what we see is maintenance windows. And John, I'm not saying that you can't have, there are some organizations that I know that can do patch management at a greater interval, but most have to align to production maintenance periods that usually are more facility maintenance, right? So if a production environment has a facility maintenance window that occurs, let's say every 6 months or every 3 quarters, or maybe annually, the OT practitioners and IT practitioners need to prepare and get ready for a maintenance window that they're going to have, let's say at the end of the year or halfway through the year, so that they can have all of the testing and validation done in a lab, because we do not want to go right to production. so that they can apply in the window of time provided, they can apply to the production systems those updates, run through some tests, and ensure that everything is going to work as it should once the plant goes back into live operation. But that question is very hard to answer because, again, similar to the previous question, every environment is going to be specific to what is the uptime requirement for productivity within that environment. So if uptime in running in production 24/7, 7 days a week, and there's only a maintenance period that is really more tied to the maintenance of the facility, then that is the IT schedule. And IT needs to understand that because that's the OT schedule. Any deviation from that needs to be addressed, it needs to be appropriately discussed, and then has to be put on some sort of a plan, right? So if you had an emergency, obviously an emergency shutdown is different than scheduled maintenance, but updates to systems in the production environment have to follow the OT production maintenance schedules. And that's why that's the challenge. And we deal with that every day is that I don't get to update on Patch Tuesday. It doesn't work like that. Don't update those systems. And that's what we found with CrowdStrike is that the updates went directly to the production systems and engineering workstations that were Windows based rebooted with a blue screen. So not very effective.
Right. All right. So we'll take some more few questions. Okay. So Bipin, you should be able to unmute and ask the question yourself. I think we'll just take 3 or 4 maximum.
Okay.
Bipin, you're available? Okay, if Bipin is not. Okay, Vikash. I suppose. Right. Chitrang or Tahir, anyone is available?
Hello.
Hello.
Hi. I'm Vikas. Thanks, Paul, for this wonderful lecture today, and thanks to the team for having this on board. So basically, I'm working in a manufacturing industry and just coming on straight to the point. So my question is going to be very specific. So I was looking for some solution which I wanted to start my OT cybersecurity. And as you told how visibility is important, because first we need to understand what we have. Until we know that, you cannot just jump into this topic. So I was looking, and I got to have a POC with some of the tools like Nozomi and Armies were two of the main which I did it. So they were like you can say with a core switch, they had their Centrix device, which was doing the packet inspection. We attached it to the core switch by span port mirroring, and we mirrored all the traffic. So for the sites on which we have the PLCs, HMIs, and all of this OT stuff into the network was pretty easy to see the firmware version, detect vulnerabilities, and into Nozomi it was also possible to see the communication like a map, like a sketch. It was there. But my question comes now is that we also have a site which has internal network into the machines. For example, the IP is like 192.168.100.xx or something. And
Yep.
it was very hard for us to find these devices because they are communicating in that their internal network via
Yep.
RFC 1918, you can say. So I don't know. They did not have any of the deploying devices or any of the miniature devices which we can use to
Yes.
intercept these network. So what should we do in this case? Should we do a manual work or how to know about this device?
Right. So there's and you touched on one of the things that you can do, right? So out of the gate, and I really appreciate the question. It's great. You could downshift into manual data collection where 80% of your asset management you can do through automation with a system like Nozomi. And then there's just going to be some environments, especially those that it could be sensitive environments too, right? But for you specifically, because it's a very specific use case, you could manage that manually. Now, the problem with that is the manual data collection and the manual upkeep of that data collection is only as good as you are, right? So, if or, and I think you kind of touched on this as well, if you can implement a data collector inside, or if there's a way to get because with VLAN spanning and then also trunking, is there a way to get those internal networks exposed through the switch to a mirror port where I can have that? If not, if it's just layer 2, then you probably
you were right. We were trying to find a gateway. So there are some of the WAGO devices which had the network card in front of the master PLC, and that's all. We were able to see the WAGO devices, but not the master PLC.
Right.
And it was
so the PLCs are they dual homed? Like they've got, and then they're talking to these separate network. They create that boundary, right? A lot of times you used to call like a PLC firewall, where the master PLC had 2 network connections, 2 Ethernets, and it would talk to PLCs downstream, but just in this little layer 2 network that was only as big as the device. Like this, I've seen it where there's like a 4-port switch sitting inside one control panel, and it's connecting to a bunch of other PLCs.
To be honest, we also have engineering workstations there. So the manual problem is that I told the operator that I need this data. Whenever you connect the engineering workstation to the PLC, you tell me the version, you open the software, but it's been 4 months now, or you can say half a year has gone, and it's very hard to do this manually. So
correct. So I think, you're going to have to figure out how to get something in the OT environment to be able to extract in that data collection. Or it's working with the Nozomi and seeing if across the bus, can the master PLC provide Nozomi with information? Because I know that I think OT Base and Landsweeper do this.
Where they can. The thing is, we were about to solve this with OT Base, and they told us that we have a pen drive. You put it in the engineering workstation when you are connecting it to the PLC, and it extracts all the data and link it to our cloud solution, the OT cloud.
There you go.
But the problem was they were charging, to be honest, 8,000 to 9,000 euros just for the POC. So Okay, but thank you so much.
Yes, absolutely. Great question.
Yeah, thank you.
Chitrank, you can go ahead.
Yeah, hi Paul. Thanks for that exciting conversation and insightful session. I would like to understand much more on the risk management on insider threats in OT. May it be a disgruntled employees or the vendors working in the OT environment. I mean, what will be your recommendation when it comes to handling those insider threats? No, because definitely we will be putting up a lot of controls at the perimeter of IT and OT integrations, putting up segmentations and all those things. But how to set up a risk management portfolio for handling the issues related to insider attacks? Because as you know, OT environments are very huge and humongous, disconnected networks. Typically, in case of a large size refinery or maybe chemical factories.
Right. I think first, and one of the attendees had brought it up in a question: physical access control. Right. So we want to any type of immediate risk, insider threat, is somebody passing through a doorway and getting physical access to be able to introduce something into the environment or have an adverse impact on the environment. So when I'm taking a look at a risk assessment, I'm always gauging what my physical risk is first, because that is a lot of times, as you have pointed out, these are vast distributed control systems, could be across regions. I can't visually see everything everywhere all the time. I may have that capability in risk controls at the network level to be able to understand what accounts are logging into what Windows systems at a SCADA level, engineering workstation level, etc. But physical access control, if I don't have control of that, then I really am blind to physically what's happening in those spaces. So I would start there and always have the monitoring of access doors, proximity cards, key card access. Where this starts to break down a little is physical keys into like a control room or a control area where the control panels may be. It was also mentioned having you can have like a trigger sensor that is connected to the PLC inside the control panel, and it's monitoring its own sensor on the control door or the control panel door opening, right? I've seen that done as well. So physical access control and having areas of monitoring or at least visibility to that kind of access. And then next would be, where are people logging into or authenticating into Windows or Linux or the more traditional operating systems? It could be the engineering workstations, as I said before, SCADA systems, local historian, database servers, and then finally, to the best of our ability, can I see access to the PLCs, or in case of insider threat, being able to monitor when I move from a run mode into a config mode, or when change is occurring on a PLC, do I have the capability to monitor and alert on that? And again, I do understand the complexity that I'm referencing or asking for here, because that's a big thing, right? To say, can I see everything that's happening on every PLC? And if it's in a point of configuration, and is the configuration being modified? It's a very difficult thing to ask, especially with some of the scale that some process control environments can be in, especially petrochemical, oil and gas, energy. These are vast. These can be vast networks or vast deployments. But I think it's physical access control, identity management, and logical access control. And then it's tracking behavior and anomalies that could be occurring on the PLCs, the HMIs, or the RTUs themselves. And this doesn't even get to with another difficult task. It's how do I ensure the validity of my level 0, level 1 field bus and sensory data that's coming in? But I think insider threat is typically physical and logical to the PLCs first, and I think you'd want to focus on that. But again, these are not easy tasks. And they'll take a lot, they'll take some considerable time and resource in order to get a plan and a structure in place. And then you're just continually improving that over time as the environment grows or changes based on the mission, goals, and objectives of the organization.
Mhm. Yeah, I understand. Yes, you're right. Thank you.
Yes.
Darshana, you can unmute yourself. Yes, go ahead.
Hi, Paul. I have a quick question here. So we have quite a few certifications for the OT professionals, like the IEC 62443, the GRADE certifications. But do you recommend OT professionals doing some certifications on the IT side so that it facilitates the work even more to develop a better understanding on the IT side?
I think that is an excellent question. So I'll answer it first like this. So if I place the responsibility on IT individuals to be able to take training, as we've talked about, the Inductive Automation University, maybe seeking out the ISA 62443 certifications, as you brought up, and then maybe looking at Mike Holcomb's industrial controls education units and library of training that he's put together that's available for free on YouTube. Then likewise, we have to maybe as OT practitioners take it upon ourselves to learn more about the IT side. And then your next question might be, if so, then what would be the certifications that you would recommend? And I think I think that it's effective to go through maybe a base level. I know this might be a little much to start out off, but there is the ISO 27001, which is largely more IT related in terms of its security controls. And if you were to achieve that certification, another one would be CompTIA has the Network Plus, Security Plus, those are great places to start. If you wanted to do everything all at once, and it was in the opening screen and the intro with my credentials on it, there's the ISACA has the CISM, so the Certified Information Security Manager certification. What I like about that one is it's not technical. It's more organizational and it's theoretical. And it gives you the understanding of the core concepts, how that may work throughout an enterprise. It covers conceptually encryption, authentication, public key infrastructure, segmentation, penetration testing, identity management, but it does so at a managerial level, as opposed to the other one is the CISSP, which can get it gets more in depth, and it can get a little bit more technical, especially in chapters 6 and 7 when you're talking about cryptography and encryption. But those are probably, I think it's start off small, like CompTIA and the Network Plus and the Security Plus, and then gauge what your level of understanding is. And then if you want, get into the ISACA CISM. And then one last point, talking about certifications, the biggest change for me, and we had that question on risk management, the biggest certification advantage to me is I had taken the CISSP, the CISM, I've taken other certifications, ISACA's C-Risk, so the risk management certification, that changed my mindset in terms of how I look at things when I'm attempting to prescribe security or safeguard safety within an environment. The ISACA certification on risk management was a game changer because it changes your mindset and you look at things differently.
Thanks, Paul. That helps greatly.
Yep.
All right. Is there anyone else who would want to ask a question? We are already overshot by another half an hour. If not, we will end the session here.
Good deal. Thank you very much. This was awesome. I really appreciate the opportunity. I appreciate everyone's time and availability. It's great.